that he's leading the wireless infrastructure item at the FCC. That's huge for us. He understands that, greatly appreciated. And I do want to say that I'm glad he was doing well in the 8th grade, and I was down at the State Department. I was one of the youngest State Department assistant secretaries they had, just for the record, okay? Okay. That was a long time ago. Good memories. Okay, I think we're getting ready here to almost. Just a second. Commissioner Carr has been a very good advocate for truth and veracity on the wireless issues for us, and we greatly appreciate his efforts to come visit it. He's got an invitation anytime he'd like to come back. Please do so. Okay. Do we have it almost set? And do we have the other panelists about ready to go? All right. Okay, then let me do the introduction. Now I'd like to turn to our keynote panel. It's been a busy morning, I realize that. Who'll be looking at expanding networks to unserved areas and underserved areas. Leading the discussion and introducing our distinguished panelists, we have Maggie Reardon of CNET. Maggie has been a CNET news reporter since 2004, where she covers mobile services, broadband, Wi-Fi, the net neutrality debate, as well as the ongoing consolidation of telecom companies. And I'd like to add that Maggie has joined us in the past. We are delighted that she could come back and join us again. So thank you, Maggie. And Maggie, come on up and I'll turn this over to you. Thank you so very much. Maggie.
Yes.
Thanks for coming.
Seating mode down.
Okay. And as Steve so kindly introduced me, I'm Maggie Reardon, and I'm going to actually let each of our panelists introduce themselves briefly here. So, Arun, why don't you kick us off?
Absolutely. Good morning. Arun Bigsheswaran. I've been in the business, wireless business in the US for about 25 years, so it's actually an honor to be here on stage at this 25th anniversary year.
Good morning, Ken Borner. I work for ATN International, and I'm responsible for the US wireless and wireline assets.
Good morning, Günther Ottendorfer, CEO Technology for Sprint, and I've worked in telecoms for the last 25 years on 4 continents.
Very good. Good morning, everyone. George Reed, Senior Vice President, Solutions and Marketing for Huawei Technologies USA. I cover the carrier space, all operators, all types of operators, and drive business development, new product introduction. And I've been in the wireless business over 35 years.
So good morning, Chris Stark. I run strategy and business development for Nokia in North America. And I've been, I'm nowhere near in the business as long as these guys. I'm still a young spring chicken.
Great. So, we all know that broadband is crucial to our everyday life now, public safety, education, healthcare, but everybody's not connected, right? I mean, and where are we in terms of connection and who is connected and who isn't?
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to start. I actually think about 3 steps, Maggie, here. There's a connect, then you have to go online, and then you have your experiences that build on top of that. If you actually look at the percentage of the US population, adult population, that have cell phones today, in rural America, that is at 94%. Urban America is at 95%, suburban is at 97%. So 94% of the people that we are talking about here have cell phones. But you got to take it to the next step, which is about getting them online. And that comes with a smartphone. So if you look at urban America, that penetration is around 77%. In rural America, the same thing is at 67%. So you've got a 10% gap already there in terms of going to the next step, from connecting people to taking them online. And I think that is a step that should be of tremendous focus for us here. Because as soon as you get that smartphone, it opens up a new window of experiences. And that is true for people wherever they live.
Well, is the barrier cost or is the barrier infrastructure?
It's very interesting. There's a study done by the Pew Institute, actually, that we can go look up at. And the distribution varies based on income level, of course, education level, and age. In fact, if you look at age, I think in the demographic segment of 18 to 29, 100% of the people have smartphones. Yeah? But when you go down to 65 plus, that percentage varies in a big way. In fact, if you look at the percentage that is online, which is the second step, we've got 41% of the 65 plus segment who are not online. And that represents a big opportunity because you've got people who are not online, but going back to the 94%, have a cell phone. So you could essentially take these people, move them to the second step by getting them a smartphone, and I think that starts to bridge the gap in a big way. So I think it's a lot about education. It's because these people are connected. It's about talking to them about the experience that they can have if they get to the smartphone world. I've got my own personal experience as well, dealing with seniors, etc. But I think it's a big education process because once you get onto that platform, you're hooked.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think a lot of it is about experience and what you deliver. So just having a device or having a connectivity in the home, if the experience is that you just wait for everything to load up and it gradually appears across the screen, I think that's very different than if you've got an experience that becomes more immersive. And I think in amongst that, then you get to the issue that it is economics around how do you build out networks that create that sort of scale, create that sort of experience, and then start hitting much less densely populated areas. And I don't think you can get away from the fact that economics plays a big part. And I think, it isn't just about whether it's the radio or the fiber. There's a whole piece that plays in about way rights and all sorts that just fits into that. And I think that fundamentally that's what has to be addressed is you have to attack the whole thing, the whole problem, in order to start unleashing some of this.
Well, what are the challenges in terms of the difference between urban versus rural?
I mean, it's cost and infrastructure, right?
Right.
And I think Steve said this morning that we've been in this industry 36 years now, and there's still 25% of the U.S. that doesn't have access to broadband or wireless. And there's a reason for that, right? We've been at it for 36 years, and there's still 25% that don't have it. So it comes down to a matter of cost and infrastructure and economics.
Well, should the government be doing more to get us there?
Absolutely, and I think they've done a reasonably good job up to this point. I'm optimistic about the future and government programs with USF, Mobility Fund 2, and CAF. I think all of those programs have been great, and they should continue to perpetuate those.
Well,
I think it is also sorry, go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, we just heard from the commissioner that he's open to changing regulation for implementing broadband, small cells broadband. So I think the government, the present administration is perhaps a little more open to push policies or reduce regulation in terms of enabling broadband delivery to more rural areas.
Now, do you think rural operators are thinking of as wireless as a way to deliver instead of the fixed broadband? Do you think that wireless can really be a competitor, particularly in rural areas, for those customers?
So I think what we see is with the development of new technologies, there will be more and more a shift in the balance between wireline and wireless. Because more things that in the past could have been done only on wireline can be done in the future on wireless. And that shift will happen. And so part of that shift is that LTE, and especially TD-LTE, has the capability of transporting so much data over a little spectrum. And that is because TD-LTE has these asymmetric capabilities so that you can tune your frequencies better to the user demand and to the user experience, because people want download. And in FDD networks, we have half of the frequencies used for uplink, half for downlink. But the reality is that the relationship between downlink and uplink is 10 to 1. Mm-hmm. And so I believe we see a big technology enablement that will help to bring those services to customers and fulfill their expectations for good user experience.
And wireless is certainly more economical than
Absolutely.
wireline delivery.
I mean, like we said before, 94% of rural adults are already covered through, I mean, they have a cell phone, which means that there is a tower that is able to reach them. So why not just piggyback on that, use some of the technologies that Gunther talked about, and take the wireless route. It allows you to leapfrog the connectivity problem and start talking about taking them online and toward the experience.
Right. I just remember, for years though, people have said, well, wireless will never completely subsume, a wired connection. So for those rural customers, I mean, is that kind of like, they'll just never get anything that's as good as what folks get in the city, or can wireless truly compete, do you think?
Yeah. I say this a lot, so forgive me if you've heard this before. There's a lot of tools in the tool basket. So whatever the right tool is for reaching the rural constituency with the kind of bandwidth demands they need, with the economics that come into play, that's what needs to be used. If it's a TDD wireless connection, by all means. And of course, the spectrum policies now, we're getting more spectrum, so if wireless becomes a reality. But if you can drive a fiber deep, do it. If you do point-to-point microwave and satisfy the demand, do it. It's all, there's a bunch of tools you can use, so let's use whichever one works
But
best
as the
for
technology
application.
advances, do you think it's an opportunity for smaller rural carriers?
Absolutely. So I'll give you an example. I mean, if we look back, and we are very impatient. I mean, that's good because it's driving development, but sometimes you have to look back. Only 5 years ago, Sprint started the LTE network. So that was the starting point, basically from zero. 5 years later, we cover now more than 306 million POPs in the US, and 8 million of them together with our partners, the rural carriers. So we have this partnership. The carriers have developed. I know that many of the carriers in the room have either deployed LTE or are going to deploy LTE. So absolutely, we can play a big role in this change. And I think we're doing that. In some areas, we are pioneers. And we are pioneers driven by this technology development that allows us to do things that haven't been thinkable 5 years ago or even 3 years ago. And that is not stopping. So the development of these networks is continuing. And I think there's a great opportunity for the mobile industry, but especially also for the rural carriers in using that. And TD-LTE, to my mind, plays a big role in that.
And you can do this without getting to 5G, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, right.
There is enough tools in the toolbox, to use Stark's analogy here, that technology that we are working with several of our customers. You can deploy that, and wireless can become a great equalizer across urban and rural. The same technologies can be deployed everywhere. In some cases, some of these technologies might even be deployed in rural areas first, because the benefit might be seen there in an even more remarkable way than urban areas. So I think all of those are options.
And I'll give you a couple of specific examples. Gabbs, Nevada, a town of, I think, less than 500 people. We deployed 4G LTE there, and now they're doing distance learning in their school. No teachers at all. It's just a screen, the teacher's remote, students come into the schoolroom, and these are kids that otherwise would have to drive hours on a bus or not go to school at all. I mean, those are the realities of these small towns.
And that's a great example of an equalizer, because you've got a network, the technology, same technology available in the urban area now deployed for an experience.
So we probably haven't mined all of the capabilities just out of LTE yet. There's a lot of use cases, I think, and a lot of bandwidth still that we can get out of it. And the sort of things that we're talking about now, I think because it's matured and because we've deployed so many networks along the way, TD-LTE, I think, is a great example of just how we can actually also address some of the uplink, downlink ratios and so on. But I think that all of that's gone in. We've already got mass networks, and it's technology that we can start leveraging to other sort of use cases and other problems. And I think there's still some runway here that we really ought to go and mine.
But how important is it to have a strong 4G network, I guess, as you look forward to 5G?
4G is your platform for business today. It's super important. It has, as many of my colleagues have said here, it's got plenty of runway left, and the spectrum is available. More importantly, the device ecosystem is robust today, and you can easily take advantage of all that. 5G will come, it'll come in different flavors, and several of 5G technologies will be implemented in 4G LTE networks already. And we have seen tremendous examples of that. Gunther can talk about that as well. So I think that roadmap will continue to build on 4G. So 4G is the right business platform.
So probably building on that point, I mean, we come from a world where our networks were voice-oriented, and that's why we have in FD, LTE, half of the resources for uplink, downlink, because in a normal conversation, it's 50-50. But in the future, in the data world, it is more like 10-1. And taking that into account, several of the technologies that will be used in 5G are already available in 4G. And that's what we call LTE+. So on the Sprint network,
So
LTE...
give me an example. What do you, when you say that, what do you mean?
I mean, for example, carrier aggregation. That will be a key technology for 5G. We do that already in 4G. Another component of our LTE+ network is beamforming. So if you go to higher frequencies, you can have more smarter antennas with more elements, and you can shape the beam, which is good for reaching customers at the edge. So it gives you more capacity in the cell, it reduces the noise in the cell, and it gives you the capability to serve more customers on the edge with good performance. These are key technologies of 5G, but we are already deploying them in 4G. So that's why 4G will play a long role. And as we roll out 5G networks, there will still be a backbone of a strong 4G network.
And I would add to that, software-defined networks or virtualization is also a key component. And if you're not working on that today, you should be working on it. It's going to be required to reduce the latency and get that core out to the edge.
I guess the point I was going to make, you mentioned 5G. I think you have to look at the maturity of the technology, and the economics go hand in hand, right? I mean, as you start out in a technology, clearly adoption and mass deployment and so on brings the economics down. And I think we're there on 4G LTE already. I think 5G offers some great opportunities in terms of increasing the bandwidth, making low latency services and so on very much ubiquitous. I think the only thing to keep in mind, though, is that it is a departure from the architecture of 4G, so there are changes that have to be accommodated, and you know, those things have to roll out. So then you look and say, well, okay, you go back to the very first point that you were asking, and it is about economics, so that's why it makes sense to try and take advantage of the fact that we are way down that curve in terms of adoption on LTE to try and get that out in terms of a wireless access plan.
Well, do you think that there's been too much hype, too much emphasis on talking about 5G? I mean, I feel like everywhere I go, people are like, 5G, and it's like, well, I thought we just had 4G. What's going on here?
Yeah, it's definitely part of the equation. There's no escaping it. We're all engaged. It's a matter of timing, when it will be available, and we'll see networks rolling out in the next year.
Is it going to be expensive to do the upgrade?
It'll ride a cost curve. There's no question about it. I think in terms of the rural markets, I think it's a consideration for their planning cycle for some time in the future. I think going back to 4G, there are things where they can optimize their network utilization. They can spectrum farm, they can spectrum share, they can do many other things on the existing network to drive that bandwidth where they need it. And 5G will be a matter of a level of maturity of the infrastructure, when it's available, can I get devices, and what makes sense for me as a rural carrier in terms of the investment and the spend and when to build out.
What is the, I guess, the business case? I mean, do we even have a business case for 5G, either in urban areas or rural areas?
Well, let's think about 5G as a basket of capabilities, right? You've got a lot of capabilities that you can build in. Some of them can be used, like we have said, already in 4G networks today. And that starts to build a case for how you monetize broadband wireless. But if you think of use cases independent of 4G or 5G, besides your basic mobile broadband experience, by the way, after almost 10 years now, we have LTE available on a device like this. Technology has progressed in a tremendous fashion. So what you can start to think about is, where do we go from here? Where do we go from this watch, for example? You've got two avenues that you can take. One is on connecting, the governors actually talked about it, embedding sensors in different kinds of places. That creates one traffic type, which is massive IoT kind of traffic type. Then you've got another avenue, which is on more critical communications. And I think the public safety avenue is an important first step. I think we will build on that to build more use cases that have real-time requirements, low latency requirements, et cetera. So if you build on these three, you've got your anchor business in terms of mobile broadband that you can use to connect more people. And then you've got a massive sensor type network, that is one avenue, and then a critical type communications, which is a third avenue. I think the rest of it will build on experiences based on these three buckets.
And I think the use cases are there for the urban environments. Rural, I think we'll have to wait and see. I agree with Arun. It's a toolbox. It's going to be an evolution, not a revolution, especially for the kinds of networks that I operate. We'll have to take it one step at a time and see how it plays out.
Yeah, well, which leads me into our next topic of spectrum, right? I mean, like that, you need the spectrum to be able to do any of these things, right? So, we just had the 600 megahertz auction, and now we're talking about more spectrum being needed. Are you guys going to ever have enough? I mean,
Never enough. Never enough.
So, first of all, with 600, did rural carriers get enough of that low band spectrum? Or, did they not I know T-Mobile did really well. They're not up here, but, they did well. What about everybody else?
Yeah, I think, ATN, we did pretty well. Again, it's a 5 megahertz carrier, so you could fill that pipe pretty quickly, right? I think from a CCA perspective, I saw statistics yesterday that suggest that the rural carriers did pretty well overall. I'm sure that included the T-Mobile spectrum. If you took that out, I'm not sure what it would look like, but I think in general we did pretty well, and it's going to be some useful spectrum that we're looking at.
So what's next in terms of what you need for spectrum?
Well, you got 3.5 gigahertz coming next, if you will. We heard there's a 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz request.
And how is that going to be
FCC.
useful for rural carriers in particular? Because I know, like with those higher frequencies, right? I mean, it doesn't travel the distances. It seems like, at least when I've talked to a lot of the bigger carriers, that's where they're hoping to concentrate that in some of their rural deployments for capacity. So how does a rural carrier leverage that?
I think one thing you can do, for example, going back to the basket of technologies, you've got something known as LAA now, LTE License Assisted Access, right? Which takes advantage of a anchor LTE carrier and 5 gigahertz spectrum, for example, which is unlicensed. That is a toolkit that is available today that you can use. And for example, even 600 megahertz, you could deploy an anchor carrier in 600 megahertz and have an associated carrier in 5 gigahertz that immediately starts to provide tremendous benefits. 3.5 gigahertz, as Reed pointed out, comes out. It gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of smaller license areas, etc., which is great for deployment in these kind of scenarios. The NPRM came out a couple of days ago. I think that will progress. That is a experiment in terms of shared license access, and the infrastructure has been built for leveraging that. So those are two immediate things that are available today for the industry to already start taking advantage of. And then I think we will come to the higher band over a period of time. But there is enough available today just to start exploiting and getting the experiences out there.
So first off, I think the way you need to look at it is mid-band, low-band spectrum, and where are we in that? And when you look and say, where did everybody get a good chunk on 600? I think it's more about, is there enough mid-band, low-band spectrum out there? I think the CBRS adds to that pool, and I think the whole concept around CBRS, when it was first conceived, was there we try and find another way to release spectrum faster, and that's where the concept of sharing comes in. I know that the 3.7 to 4.2 looks a really interesting band as well. I think in terms of its usability, it looks like it has a lot of applicability in things like fixed wireless access and so on. So I think it's got some good applicability in the rural markets. I think the other thing about it is it's a big chunk of spectrum. I mean, CBRS is 150 megahertz. So when you look at that and you look at what sort of service you can actually deliver, you know, you're starting to get something that, go back to what I said originally, you have to create an experience that people want to pay money and feel like, you know, they got value. And I think you see with that sort of chunk of spectrum, you can do that.
But do you think the sharing, the way it's been proposed and how that spectrum will work, I mean, is that going to work? I mean, this is kind of a new sort of experiment. You know, will the auction work? You know, will people want to invest in that? It seems like it's a pretty flexible.
Well, so on that, look, I think with any of these things, when you look at, take on CBRS, and you mentioned sharing, if you look at how many companies are working on making a sharing scheme that's going to work, I think that's where it comes down to. With all of these things, it's how much effort and brain power we start putting onto these things. And the amount of effort that's going in there, the contributions from just about everybody that you could imagine to try and make that successful. I think it will be successful in terms of giving people what they want out of that CBRS band. So yeah, I think there's good momentum there, and there's phenomenal sort of attention being played by just about everybody in this industry at the moment.
Yeah, I would agree. It's just, you know, give it a try, right? See if it works and work out the wrinkles as we go along.
Yeah.
And I'm particularly interested in it from a fixed wireless perspective and offloading other spectrum that I have and doing carrier aggregation or LAA, right? Yeah. I think, you know, we're going to see most of the companies that we work for not be wireless or wireline, but broadband, right? And how you deliver that broadband, you know, that last mile technology could be anything, and you just got to figure out what is the best way and the most economical way to get it to people.
Yeah.
And then we can build on one thing, which is Gunther talked about beamforming. You can bring beamforming technology into the CBRS band, and then make sure that the reach is out there for the right kind of people who need it. So I think all these things will start to work, and yes, it will work.
And to add to that, I think CBRS is something that will complement traditional spectrum. It will not replace it because of the nature of the coordination. That makes it a little bit more complicated. But if I look at the spectrum that is available today, and it is timely because last week we showed a little bit what you can do with the spectrum. So we did that last week. We use now 2.5 spectrum a lot more, and we use those modern technologies I talked about. And the proof that it's working is that year on year, we are the most improved carrier as measured by Ookla, and we have increased nationwide our speeds by 33% in LTE by using those technologies. So I believe 2.5 has a lot of potential. It is nearly the same amount, or in some places even more than the CBRS spectrum. So I think for a rural carrier, that's a great opportunity and something to look at.
Gunther, I wondered what you were carrying in the back. So now I know this one.
Now we answered that question.
So I think there's another important point is in the CBRS band, it's the price tag.
Right.
You have generally available for essentially free. There's no massive investment you have to make to gain utilization of that spectrum, and that's an important point because let's face it, when these auctions have come up in the past and you have to spend billions of dollars to get spectrum, that's not in the realm of affordability for some of the rural carriers.
Yeah.
So GAA in and of itself is a nice spectrum to gain access to, and the use case, fixed delivery in many cases, it's another tool in the toolbox.
And that C-band 3.7 to 4.2 is another 500 potentially,
right?
500
megahertz there.
500 megahertz, big chunk.
I'm going to shift gears again here. You know, earlier we had two panelists talking about public safety and FirstNet, but I want to talk a little bit about just, you know, preparing networks for disasters just for the general public. You know, I think in the last hurricanes that we saw here in Houston area and in Florida and in Puerto Rico, you know, Puerto Rico was completely wiped out. But in Florida and, you know, coastal Texas, you know, the hardest hit areas were completely wiped out, and you had service sort of radiating out from that. But when you look at those hardest hit areas, you know, how much should the infrastructure be hardened? Is that even, you know, is it even economically feasible to make it so that everybody, you know, just the regular person can access, we're not even talking about public safety, but just, you know, it seems like the cost is pretty high, but what should carriers be doing better? And I'm sure that it's got to be a burden, particularly for smaller.
Yeah, I'll answer that. I mean, we have networks in U.S. Virgin Islands that, you know, they withstood the first hurricane fairly well. I think 80 to 90% of our network survived. Then you had a second hurricane roughly a week later, another Category 5, and that one took a toll. Not many networks are built to withstand, you know, 2 Category 5 hurricanes within a couple of weeks and sustained winds of 200 miles an hour, right? So you have to, and again, it comes down to a matter of economics. I think we need to learn from this and make sure that when we do reconstruct the network, we're putting towers up that can withstand these type of events, and everything suggests that they're going to continue to increase in frequency. You know, secondly, though, it's a combination of things. It's not only the tower, it's keeping the antennas on the tower, it's the power to the site. Mm-hmm. What kind of alternative energy can you bring there? You know, batteries are going to last you a few hours. You could put generators there. They're good for, you know, a day or a week. They're not meant for a continuous duty cycle. It's expensive to deploy and to maintain those. And then you have wired backhaul and transport.
Yeah.
But do you think you need to think differently?
I think we need to think a little bit differently, but there's only so much you can do, and I think it's a collective effort, right? With the power companies and the landline companies who are potentially bringing, you know, fiber to your cell site or a nearby location, right? So you have to partner up and make sure that you know, that you invest as much as you can in that. Again, do you plan for you have to plan for the events that are going to occur roughly every year. So do you plan for the 100-year or the 500-year event? That's a little bit more difficult.
Yeah.
And to add to that, I mean, if I look at the events in Florida, Houston, within the first 10 days, a lot got restored. So the industry worked really well together. I think everyone helped out each other with transmission. That is so important. Power came back pretty. In Puerto Rico, it's more difficult because we have especially the power problem and the generator and the refilling of the generators and all that. But also there, I think, as an industry, we work very well together. So I would think that is a real positive. Can it be done even better? I mean, network investment is like a blanket. It's always too short somewhere. So when we talk about bringing more coverage to rural, would you rather do that or prepare for a 500-year event? That's the kind of decisions we have to think about. And so I think what we have seen as reaction times, generally we can say that is very acceptable. The other thing is probably on the services side. I think as carriers, we have to work together to provide voice and SMS really quick. That's basic. Data can come a little bit later, and we have also seen that as a response from the customers. So I would say there is a good basis we can build on, and we cannot prevent against everything.
And I think one thing that I heard now in Puerto Rico, where you've got inter-carrier roaming turned on, so that the phones are available to choose any site that is up and running. I think that is a great way to just get the basic services up and running. So.
Yeah.
And I'm going to pivot one more time here. We've got, you know, I think big rumors floating around. Gunther, I'm sure you don't want to comment here, but you know, there's talk of Sprint and T-Mobile merging. They're two members of this association. I'm just curious, you know, are we entering a new phase of consolidation, and what do you all do you think that's good for smaller carriers? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? Is it good for the industry? Does anybody want to answer?
Is that you, Gunther? Is that yours?
Well,
He's sitting in the right seat.
All right.
let me start by saying the following. I mean, we published yesterday our second quarter financial quarter numbers, and our numbers are really good. We made gains in postpaid, prepaid in our business segment. We reduced costs significantly. So we have the company has significantly improved, and that gives us also the possibility to explore opportunities. And our chairman and our CEO have been public about that they are looking into possibilities. And that's what I can say from our side. But I think the turnaround, the momentum of the turnaround has significantly increased. The numbers prove that. And that brought us into the situation where there are different possibilities to explore.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's certainly going to, if it happens, it would change the landscape of things. Sprint and T-Mobile are good partners of ours. They roam on our networks, right? I know Sprint enjoys having the coverage that we provide, T-Mobile as well. But you can look at it from different perspectives, right? We would lose one roaming carrier. If you look at it from different perspectives, it might be good for the consumer, right? I think Sprint and T-Mobile might be stronger together than they are separately. And does that?
It seems like prices might go up.
I don't know.
As a consumer,
I don't know.
like that.
I mean, there's probably not too many other places in the world where you have more than 3 or even 2 competitive carriers. And I think if you look across the world at pricing, it doesn't vary too greatly. Is 4 much different than 3? I don't know. I'm not sure how that would affect pricing, but I'll let these guys comment on that.
Yeah.
We need to hear from the rural carriers in the audience what they think on this topic.
Isn't really the problem. With all these things, you can imagine a range of outcomes from everything from the worst possible to the best possible. And the trouble is that it tends to sort of evolve as these things happen, right? So sitting here and saying, is that going to happen? I don't think any of us really know. And but is there a range of possibilities in terms of an outcome? Maybe. I just think that when you look at consolidation, whether it's carrier consolidation or whatever, I think with a lot of it, it's done around a particular business need and looking forward. I mean, I know when we did the acquisition of Alcatel-Lucent for Nokia, I mean, it was all about trying to look forward and make sure that we could try and provide all of the services and so on that we feel our customers wanted going into the future. So I think, there's a lot of good rationale whenever you look at some of these things as to why you want to go ahead. The range of outcomes, I think, gets decided sometime after, doesn't it?
I guess we'll have to see. Yeah.
I think the consolidation side of it, not just carrier to carrier in the wireless space, but when you start to look at MSOs and carriers, or someone who's a fiber broadband provider in a wireless carrier, I think those start to create some really interesting dynamics. Because as we look at networks in the future, there's always going to be the need for that big pipe to get as deep in the network as possible. And the combination of that type of provider with a wireless provider is really interesting. And that can drive some economics and savings as well.
I guess we could say cable could be the new competitors. I don't know.
That's
Could be.
the angle.
Could be.
I think that's what you're going to see. Again, if this happens, I'm not sure there'll be much more consolidation beyond that, but you're certainly going to see, as I said earlier, cable companies, wireless companies, traditional wireline companies, they're going to become broadband, right? I mean, there's a lot of cable companies looking into last mile wireless access.
Is that something you think that the rural carriers should be sort of concerned about, having that competition?
I don't think so. I think, again, it's too expensive to get cable or fiber into some of these places, and I think we have a skill set and a presence that they don't have. Not that they couldn't acquire it, but I think there's a lot of opportunity still to get into that last 25% of the U.S. that doesn't have any broadband today.
And it brings us a little bit full circle to your first question. What are the opportunities for rural carriers? And I believe, look, if I look at the technology and what it allows, we have done recently in San Francisco and in Seattle a massive MIMO demo with Ericsson. We did one with Nokia. So massive MIMO is a technology that is relatively cheap to deploy and is a stepping stone to 5G. That is a great opportunity for rural carriers. That's also saying you can influence yourself. So I see a lot of possibilities within an LTE network to do a lot more than was possible in the past and to shift the balance we talked about before between wireline and wireless. And so I think that is the great opportunity here.
Great, great. Well, I want to thank you all for joining me here. This was a really fun discussion. So,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you. Great to be here.